I love technology and I love designing AV systems. I've been doing it for over 15 years now, and I've designed systems for some of the world's largest companies. And I want to talk today about something that's near and dear to my heart, something really at the core of AV design, and that is the AV schematic. So in this video, I want to break down what an AV schematic is, what do we use it for, and really show you all the individual pieces. Just like in our How to Read AV Drawings video, you'll see that once you understand the individual elements, they're actually not as intimidating as they might look at first. They're actually pretty easy to understand. A schematic in its most basic form is just a bunch of boxes with some lines in between. Boxes representing hardware and lines representing the connections. To paraphrase the kind of official definition of a schematic, it's an abstract representation of something. You're using symbology. So this drawing is not to scale. It's not trying to look like the real thing. It's definitely not trying to look realistic. It's really just showing us what are the connections between a system, or how does the system work. The schematic can touch on every single aspect of an AV system's life cycle. So it's really important, if you're involved in audiovisual stuff, that you have an idea how to read these drawings. And again, if you understand the individual pieces, it's actually pretty easy to understand. It's not as complicated as they might look at first. So it's getting pretty hot out here in the park at the moment, and it sounds like I can hear thunder. I think it might rain soon. So I think it's about time we get inside, get back into some air conditioning, and let's have a look at some drawings. Look, I got to show you this. It's like a death drop. Careful on the streets of KL. There are death drops everywhere. You don't want to be walking around filming yourself like an idiot falling down a death drop. Okay. Right, reading AV schematics, let's go. As always, if you want to consume this content faster, set it on 1.5 speed, or if your brain can handle it, 2 times speed, and it'll help you get through the videos much faster. So, what is the purpose of an AV schematic? Well, it starts off in the design phase, where it often can be like the first sketch, where we're figuring out what's going on. The designer will figure out what boxes we need and how everything's going to connect together. Then when we need to make a bill of materials to price up the project, we're usually referencing the schematic for that. Then when it comes to show the client why this thing's going to cost so damn much, then the schematic it can be used in that scenario. Not always, but we have like a pre-sale schematic I'll show you that sort of gives you a simplified version. When it comes to the installation, the guys on site need to know how to connect everything. When it comes to programming, and someone needs to figure out how is this box connected, what is the make and model, but also what is the kind of wiring connection I have to it to control it. The commissioning engineer, who's the guy who is puts the final polish on the system, does the final setup. He might need to know, how can I control those speakers because I want to tweak just what's happening at the front of the room, or is it all one loop? He can see that from the schematics. And then the service guys coming back potentially years later to figure out what's going on, they'll need it. And then if you're designing the system, like an upgrade of the system, if they want to put a new box into it, or then you need to see whether you've got a new input available, or even if it's like a fresh, like a complete refresh, you might want to have a look if there's anything that makes sense to reuse. So as I said before, it really does touch on every single aspect of the AV system's life cycle. So let's have a look at a couple different kinds of schematics now. Now, I started off using only mine, but I wanted to really give a bit more context, so I have used some other people's schematics in this. Everything I've used, there's no client or project names, it's all very old stuff that I had lying around, so hopefully no one's going to get upset at me. I don't think so. So let's start off with a hand-drawn schematic. This is where I will start when I'm trying to work out an idea on how a system's going to work, how it's going to go together, and it is essentially the kind of the birthplace. And this, unless you really know the system, if it's something you've designed many times, and then you might not need to actually sort of hand draw it out, but this is really a good place to start drawing. And the concept schematic might also be, it doesn't have to be pen and paper, or in my case, iPad and stylus. You might want to use a simple tool like a Visio, like a Draw.io, where you can just put some simple blocks in it and start kind of figuring out how your system's going to work. Then we have the high-level block diagrams that don't show us any of the inputs or outputs, or don't really show us much of what's going on. And these are the ones that can be used for clients to help them understand what the system will look like. They can also be used if you have like standards documents around this is the business standard on how we want our AV systems set up. Similar version of this is the graphic version of that, where we're using photos of the equipment. This one's really good for clients. It makes them a lot easier for them to see and understand what's going on pretty quickly. Then we have flow diagrams. So again, we don't have specific inputs and outputs. These are often used if you're putting something out to tender. So maybe if you're the consultant and you want to allow the integrator, the person bidding on that job, to be able to choose whatever brands they want, but you need to give them basically a steer of what's required for the project. Then you'll notice, like on this drawing here, this is just a little snippet of the drawing. We don't have any makes or models. We just got a general flow of how things are connected, and kind of this is the gist of what we're looking for. But depending on what make and model of product that the supplier decides to go with, there's going to be some sort of adjustments into the finer details of the connections. Sometimes we'll split out schematics by subsystem. So in this case, this is actually an old residential job, and there was a full AV system, but the lighting system is broken out just to make it simpler to read. So it's a small system. So we sometimes break the schematics out by subsystem. And then sometimes by level. This is a really, really old drawing. This is maybe, I don't know, 14 years old. Some people who will recognize these old Crestron touch panels will have an idea just how old this is. But just to show that just another kind of format for the same, for a schematic drawing, this is broken out by floor. So you've got basement, ground, first floor, second floor, third floor, fourth floor. And this was actually a residential project that I was working on, again, some time ago. So now sometimes you will see a mixture of trying to mix different drawings, and that's what this was one of mine from a while ago, looking at trying to do. This is essentially like an elevation drawing, so you can see the table box, and you can see the floor box, and I was trying to communicate with people, make it easier for them to understand exactly what the connections were between the floor to under the table to inside of the table box. I don't think this is correct. I don't think this is the right way to go about doing things, because you're kind of going cross-purpose here. This is not an abstract drawing. You're trying to mimic reality, and it's not correct. I think it's really important that we keep the definition of the lines between different drawings. So you always go to a certain kind of drawing to get this certain kind of information, and as soon as you start blurring those lines, you open yourself up to there being discrepancies between the different things. So this is a version that you may come across, but I don't think this is really ideal. What's next? And so then complete, or compiti, whatever, there's a spelling mistake there. Complete system diagrams, where sometimes if you've got a big system, you might want to lay things out in a sense that is too big to print, but just doing it in a digital format just so you can make sure everything lines up and everything connects. Or you might have an entire system on a page. Or sometimes if you're using large format plotting, so like printing onto really big pages like A1, A0, you might do a full system like this. But most of the times we'll break it out into smaller, more digestible pieces, but it really depends on the project. Okay, now let's talk about the individual parts that make up the schematic. So one of the key things is the products. So we've got the boxes, and on the first in the image here, we've got essentially a box. So this is an 86-inch panel, and it's got some input. So these represent the connectors on the side of the screen. Or we might just use the symbol. So in this case, we've got LED TV, so it's just a box. Now, I quite like doing a mix of both. So I will put in the box, I'll show all of the inputs, all of the outputs, but then also add the image. And the reason why I like doing that, and I think you won't run across a lot of these, this is fairly unique to how I do schematics. I'm sure other people do, but the reason why I like doing that is because it makes it very fast to read. If you've just got boxes everywhere with labels on them, you have to read all the labels on the boxes to try to get a feel for what's going on. Whereas if you have the symbol, you can sort of very quickly look at the page and go, oh, there's the display, there's the speakers, there's the microphones, and you can orientate yourself in the drawing a lot faster that way. But there is a trade-off on this, and I've had a lot of back and forth with different people I've worked with over the years, and that is on a space factor. So you can see here, I'm taking up this big space for my display. See how small this little LED symbol is. I'm taking up this big box with all the inputs and outputs, and then I've gone and slapped a picture on top, so that the amount of vertical space that this particular thing is taking up is taking up a lot of space. And that does factor in when we start to draw and we're trying to figure out how we can squeeze everything onto the page. Okay, so couple of other examples here. So these two are the same box I wanted to show you. Here's one that I've done. Here's one. This is actually an official Crestron one, I believe. And their one's interesting. So they've actually drawn the kind of connector, which is quite nice. You can see what the connector physically looks like. My drawings here, I've actually got them just in brackets, a little shorthand for what the physical connector style is on the box. And then I've got the label of what it is. Now there's some things missing here. So you notice that I have got the antenna connections shown in the block, but in the Crestron drawing here, they're not showing those antenna connections. And again, there's a space trade-off. So some people will only show the connectors that they're using, or the most relevant connectors, and then some people, I kind of favor showing every single connector in and out. So the inputs on the left-hand side, the outputs on the right-hand side. And it means that if you want to add, even if you're not using those connectors this time, if you want to add things into the system or think about different ways to connect the system, it's quite nice having a reference of every single connector on there. Then we have things like speakers here, where the connection isn't that complicated. The connectors are generally pretty much the same on every kind of speaker, so we don't really need a big box. And again, to take up the space, we don't want 8 of these big boxes when we can just have 8 of these little symbols that represent the speakers. So symbols over boxes. And for wireless products, so like this wireless handheld, it's not physically connected into the system. We don't need to look at the wire connection, but it is an important part of what's in the room and how the system functions. So we'll have that as a symbol with these little wireless signs on it. Areas. So in drawings, a lot of the times we will have the different parts of the system broken out into different areas to give you some idea of where they are located inside of the space, or inside of the room, or inside of the building. So in this case, you can see outside the room here, we've got a dashed line and then a room booking panel, and then and this grey dashed line here, which represents the table, so all of the equipment that's mounted to the table, and then we've got a ceiling and display location over here. So the areas are usually grey and the lines are usually dashed, and so they're usually lighter, so they don't take away from the main components that you're looking at, but gives you some frame of reference of where the equipment is located in the space. Now we have lines here connecting between the boxes, so we can see we've got an HDMI out. It's out because it's on the right side of the box, coming to an HDMI input on the left hand side of the box. And these cables are different colors, and so the colors help us differentiate the different kinds of signal or the different types of cable that are being used. I've noticed, particularly in the US, I don't know if it is just in the US, but some people don't use colors. They'll use black lines for everything, but I think it really is helpful if you have different colors for the different signal types. Again, it makes it a lot faster to read and figure out what's happening inside of the system. And then we've got tags. You'll see these little pieces of cable that are sort of flapping out here but not connected anywhere. So why do we have cables that aren't connected? Well, the idea of the tag is essentially to keep the drawing clean and readable, and we'll usually put these on things that aren't where they're connected to isn't critical. So for instance, the power connection. Where in the power strip they're connected to, and if we do want to document that, we can document that in a different place, but you can connect the power anywhere and it's going to power the unit. And the similar scenario for the network connection. You can plug that into the network port and it's going to work. Now, yes, there is an exception to that. That's technically not right. You may have different VLANs and different port setups on your network switch, but we can document that in another place. But if we had an individual line for every single power connection and then an individual line for every single network connection, the drawing starts to get out of hand and there's a lot of stuff going on everywhere. So as a method to avoid that and try and keep things clean, we use these little tags so that we don't have to show the physical connection from particularly from equipment to power or equipment to network switch, because generally there's a lot of those connections and they're not critical, or if they are critical, again, we can document that in a different separate drawing. Connections, and what do we got here? Ribbons and buses. So when we talk about ribboning, it's where we have multiple cables that all run together. And so you see I've got a bunch of, these are microphone cables going into a DSP, and how they all run through. Now, the thing with a ribbon is it takes up quite a lot of space again. And you'll hear me talk about space a bit, because the more compact we can make a drawing, the bigger we can make all the icons, the easier it is to read. And so for making really nice readable drawings, we want to keep everything nice and drawn nice and tight. So one solution to avoid these large ribbons is using buses. And so I've got some buses coming out of this matrix switcher here. So you've got individual lines are thin and they hit this thick line. And so this thick line basically represents all of those, a ribbon of all of those connections going out to somewhere else in the drawing. So you can see here I've got on the output side, I've got a bunch of little cables which hit this thicker bus, and then the bus line runs along and basically breaks out into the separate individual devices. So it's just another way that we can, again, save space and not have just masses of cable taking up a lot of space on the schematic. Ooh, I'm over here now. Cable IDs, so these are the cable labels which go on to the cable. So this little bit of text that you can see sitting on top of the line. On most schematics, that kind of label there will represent a physical sticky label on the cable itself. Obviously, the reason being that this is, well, it's very easy to see on this drawing that this microphone receiver goes into this DSP. When that is all wired into the rack amongst hundreds of cables, you're not going to be able to see that. You can't trace that. It's very difficult to trace those cables back. So by having a label on the back of the box here and a label on the back of the box here, when I'm looking at this DSP in real life in the back of the rack, I can see, yes, in input 1 here, this is mic 1. This is the microphone 1 input. Now we want to start putting labels on the schematics as well, so there can be some important information depending on the kind of product it is. So in this case here, this style of speaker, there's a setting, a tap setting, and we'll get into 100 volt speaker systems and how that all works in future videos. But for now, let's just say there is a setting we call a tap on the speaker, and so we want to note that on the schematic so the people that are installing it know exactly what setting to put on the speaker before they install it in the roof. Very important. You want to set it before you install it in the roof. You don't want to have to be coming back and changing that if that has not been set correctly. So really important we capture that on the drawing. Then we have the cable ID up here again. So in this case, because this cable is loops between, it's sort of one cable that loops between devices, we've got one cable ID that represents that whole cable. And then runs across pages. So we may have most of the equipment in a certain location, but we might have 1 or 2 cables that run back out to a separate location. So the different people will document this differently. Some people will say reference the drawing ID. So basically this line carries on a separate drawing on a separate page. In this case, how I've got it documented out is it's from room number 3.52. So that's the room number it comes from. I can reference the drawing for this, and it's coming from the amplifier number 1, and it's channel E of that amplifier. So they're using letters for the different channels. So that's what that's showing me. Let's talk about legends. Hey, I got a guy there. Hey, huh? I did not mean to do that. That wasn't in the script. But legends. Let's talk about legends. Not that kind of legends. Not talking about Arnie. We're talking about on the side of the drawing, on the title block, you will have a legend or a key that will basically explain what the different parts, what the different things on the drawing are. So this will be quite different, again, depending on what drawing you're looking at. So in this case, I'm showing what the different colors of the different lines mean as far as the signal types, and then those little connectors, the connector abbreviations on the boxes, what they actually mean. Again, this will be quite different depending on which drawing you're looking at, but it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with the legend first before you get too deep into the schematic. Okay, so here's an example of a complete schematic, and So generally, we want to read from left to right. So unless, other than certain, I guess, Japanese or Asian countries, everybody reads from left to right. And so we want to basically run the signal flow from left to right. So on the left we have the inputs, the things that are generating signal, the things that are or inputs into the system. Then we'll run that through into the middle, where we'll have the processing and the switching and the distribution, amplification, all of that kind of thing. And then that would then run through to the right side of the drawing, where we have the outputs. So the screens and speakers and projectors and the things that actually output the signal. Very loosely, again, a lot of these drawings will depend on multiple factors, what someone's trying to translate, but I feel like that is the most intuitive way of making something readable. So if I'm looking at this little drawing here, I can see from my areas that this particular box is outside of the room. I've got the make and the model there. I've got a little LAN tag, so I know that there's one data connection required for that. Then on the table, I've got two microphones, and the microphones have an orange cable here, so analog signal I learnt from my legend, and it comes out of here, runs along and into my Cisco video conferencing device. I've got a touch panel with green, so green is network for my drawings, runs along and goes into this RJ45, this peripheral port. And you see, so we've got a laptop here. There's a red HDMI which runs to under the table, so you can see I've got an under the table area here. That goes into my little video distribution box here, and that then has a network cable that runs from there to, what's this, behind display location. So where the display is, it then turns it back into HDMI and then feeds into the HDMI 1 input on my system. So, and then we've got a little, underneath the table, we've got a little PC here, so that's another source. So there's a local PC. Very simple drawing, but hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're doing when we're reading it. So we can see the makes and the models. We have a signal flow generally from left to right, and then we can see the areas to give us an idea of where the equipment is inside of the room. Okay, nearly done. So schematics show us how everything connects and how it works. It's abstract, so we're not trying to look like the correct size or scale of the individual things. This is kind of like a logical drawing. There is always a balance at play with the person drawing it around the amount of detail they include versus how much space they have on the page versus how easy it is to read. We can put a massive amount of detail onto one page, but if it becomes too hard and too complicated, then people are going to struggle to read it. So there's always a balance to be had there, and again, we'll talk more about that in future videos. Just a quick important point. If you're new to reading schematics, are you looking at the most current drawing? Really important. If you're watching this video and you're going to go to site, you really want to make sure that you're working from the most current drawing, and also has it been printed in color. So if the drawings are those lines, as I showed you, have used color to indicate different signal types, you don't want to print out a bunch of black and white ones and go to site. Sounds silly, but it does happen. So just things to be aware of when looking at your drawings. If I didn't cover something, or you have a drawing that contradicts, or you've got questions about a drawing, feel free to ask me. I'm happy to field any questions that wasn't covered in this video. That is it though. You've made it to the end. Well done, and I'll see you in the next one.